Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, my dear students. Now, we've been talking about monopoly in the last lecture. We completed our discussion of perfect competition and we began discussing how a monopolist would maximize his profits given the market demand curve. And we saw that a monopolist would maximize his profits by following the same rule that we applied in perfect competition and in any other market structure, that is by producing at the level where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. But we noted that the major difference that this had with perfect competition, the case there, was that in perfect competition, price was also equal to marginal cost, whereas in a monopoly, price was not equal to marginal cost. Price was greater than marginal cost. So this was the key difference that we identified between a monopoly and a perfect competition, firms trying to maximize their profits. Now, we also talked a little bit about how a monopoly was defined. We gave the examples of different public utilities and big organizations in our own country. We talked about PIA, WAPDA, I think we talked about the Pakistan Television Corporation as well. And we tried to understand why such companies existed as monopolies for such a long period of time, and they still do in certain parts of the country and for certain segments or certain types of markets. And the argument that was presented in the first case was the existence of scale economies. That is, the existence of economies of scale permitted monopolies to retain their monopoly position. This is where we ended our previous lecture. Now let's try to take our understanding a little bit further by seeing what the other reasons are why a monopoly firm can retain its monopoly position. Now, another reason that comes to mind immediately is product differentiation or brand loyalty. I gave the example of Bhaje de Pai in the previous lecture. And the point that I was trying to make there was that if people become brand loyal, that is, if they develop a taste for a certain product or a certain brand, then they will go to that brand and they will consume that brand and not go anywhere else. So the person who sells that brand has or faces an inelastic demand curve. That is, whether he raises his price or decreases his price, it will not have much impact on the demand for his product. The product's brand is well established. Another example of this could be Coca-Cola and Pepsi. Why are there only two large soda companies in the world? Can other companies not produce soda? Cannot produce things like Pepsi or Coke or Sprite and 7-Up? Is it impossible? Not really. I mean, it's possible. So what is it that precludes or prevents other companies from jumping in? And the argument here is that Coca-Cola and Pepsi have developed such brand loyalty. They have advertised so heavily. They have loyal customers. So if you go to a market and somebody says, well, sir, here is Coke, here is Pepsi, and here is this third soda that has just come to my shop. Will you like to test this? You will say, no. I will stick with Coke or Pepsi. This is because Coke and Pepsi have successfully invested in brand promotion. They have promoted brands to such an extent that people only want to consume either Coca-Cola or Pepsi. And this is why the soda market is a duopoly. Duopoly means where there are two players. But the same argument can be extended to the case of a monopoly as well. That is, if an individual firm develops its brand so well, that is, it makes its customers so loyal to its product, then those customers will not buy the products of any other firm. So there is no point in any other firm trying to enter the market because it will not be able to sell its product. Now, a third reason why a monopoly firm could retain its position of monopoly and not allow any other firm to enter relates to some strategic decisions that the monopoly firm can take. Consider a firm which is making supernormal profits. It's the only firm in the industry, and as we saw earlier, it is possible for a monopoly firm to make supernormal profits in the long run. So here is a firm which is making very large profits. Now when you make very large profits, you attract attention. People think, well, why is this person or this company making such huge profits and not me? So other businessmen will at least try to come into the market. Now let's try to see why it is not possible for the others to come in. What can the monopolist or the person who owns the monopoly do in order to ensure that the other people who also want to jump into the industry and get some pie of the cake, the profit cake that the monopolist alone is having, how can it stop those new entrants? Now the answer here lies in what economists call limit pricing. That is, you price your product in order to limit any other entrant, any other possible firm from entering, right? Now, what is limit pricing about? The underlying thing that you need to know here is that when a firm is already established, that is, if a monopoly has been operating, let's say, for 10, 15, 20 years, then it is likely to have developed certain cost efficiencies. That is, it is likely to have an average cost curve which is lower than the average cost curve of any new company or any new firm that just comes into the industry. Why is that? Well, it is obvious. When you are in a business for quite a while, you learn the tricks of the trade, you develop contacts with suppliers, you learn by doing. Whenever you produce more and more products, your costs of production fall. You learn how to run your plant better. But when a new firm comes in, it has to learn all these things afresh, and therefore its costs of production are likely to be higher than the existing monopolist. Now a monopolist knows this, and he wants to take advantage of this fact that his costs are lower than the entering firm. But how exactly can he take advantage of this? Let's illustrate through a slide. As shown in the figure, there are two average cost curves drawn. ACE, which is the average cost curve for the entrant, that is the firm which wishes to enter the market, and ACM, which is the average cost curve for the monopolist. As you can see, the monopolist, because he has been established for quite a while and has been producing the good for a long time, has a lower average cost curve than the entrant who wants to join in. However, note that the new entrant, if it is to compete successfully with the monopolist, must charge the same price or a lower price than the monopolist. Otherwise, why would people buy the product from the new entrant? So that is clear. The new entrant must charge the same price as the monopolist. Now let's see what price the monopolist will charge. Well, if the monopolist were to go by the book, that is, if the monopolist were to maximize his profits, he would produce the output where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That is where the MR curve intersects the MCM curve, that is the marginal cost curve for the monopolist. And this happens at output level QM star. Now, if you go further up and see where this QM star hits the average revenue curve, you can, as we've done before, read off the price that the monopolist will charge. And this comes out to PM star. So this is the price that the monopolist should charge if it wants to maximize its profit. But note here that the monopolist is aware of this entrant who wishes to enter the market. And in order to ensure that the new entrant does not enter the market, the monopolist might choose a price lower than PM star. So the monopolist might choose a price which is closer to PL, or below PL, where PL is the price which corresponds to the lowest point on the average cost curve of the new entrant. Now, why is PL a limiting price, or why would the monopolist choose this price? This is simple. Any price below PL or even PL itself will not allow the new entrant to make any profits. Note that if the monopolist charged PM star, the new entrant would still be able to make some profits, because the point at which PM star intersects the demand curve would be still higher than the average cost for the new entrant at QM star. But when the monopolist charges or lowers the price to PL, then the new firm has no chance of making any profits, because PL is at the bottommost point of its average cost curve. So this, my friends, is how a monopolist can use active strategies, active pricing strategies, to limit the entry of potential firms and retain his monopoly position. So monopolies do not just result because of natural factors. Now, it is possible for that to happen as well, and we saw that when we discussed natural monopolies in our previous lecture, towards the end of the previous lecture. But what is important is that there are other reasons why monopolies exist as well, and some of these involve strategic actions, conscious decisions by monopolists to deter the entry of potential firms. Another two important reasons in this line are the control over factors of production, or the control over demand chains. That is, supply chains and demand chains. If these are controlled by the monopolist, it becomes very difficult for any other firm to enter the market. Let me give you an example. The company Alcoa, Aluminium Corporation of America, was a company which before World War II owned the entire raw material source for the production of aluminum. As you know, the raw material that is used in the production of aluminum is bauxite, and that was owned entirely, all the reserves of bauxite were owned by Alcoa, and therefore Alcoa produced aluminum for the entire United States of America. There was no other firm which could come into the business, because the factor of production, that is the raw material needed for producing aluminum, was in the control of a single firm. Let me give you another example. What happens when a firm controls the people who are selling or distributing the products to the final customers? So, for example, you could have Pepsi and Coke, which have their own distribution network. So what they do is that they sell their bottles in bulk to distributors, and those distributors then sell it to the Cocas and to the outlets from which you and I purchase Coca-Cola. Now, what happens if Coca-Cola controls or totally influences these distributors who control the supply of Coca-Cola to the market? They can do that. They can give them bonuses. They can give them some incentive, cash incentive, to ensure that no other person is able to distribute any other product to these Cocas. So if a firm controls the distribution channels of the product very well, if it controls the warehouses, if it controls the wholesalers very well, then it can ensure that no other firm is able to route or channel its product to the market. So control of either the demand side or the supply side chains can ensure that the firm will not have any competition from outside. Now, there are two more reasons why a firm or how a firm can retain its monopoly position. And one of them relates to legal protection. It is possible for a firm to have legal protection cast in a way that no other firm can enter the market, at least in that segment or that part of the industry. And I'll give you the example of drugs. Some drugs, when they have been produced by a particular firm, get they get patents on those drugs. That is, no other firm can produce the same drug. That is, imitation of that drug is banned. And this happens for any invention, any product which is invented, or any process or technique which is invented. Firms usually get patents on that. And therefore, it is not possible for other firms to legally enter the market unless they can devise their own technology or method to produce the same product, which sometimes is not easy to do. Think about Microsoft and all these Windows 98, 2000, and 2002 Office editions that it churns out every year. It is not possible for other pirators to just print off these copies of Microsoft. Some people do it. I mean, copyright violation is very common in third world countries at least. But legally, Microsoft has copyright protection. That is, it is not allowed for other firms to simply copy the product that Microsoft produces and then sell it in the market. So some firms can establish their monopoly position due to legal protection. The last reason that explains why firms can retain their monopoly position relates to the aggressive nature in which firms behave when other firms want to enter. So, for example, let's say there is firm A, which is already in the market, which is a monopoly firm, that is the only firm in the market, and firm B wants to enter into the market. Now, if firm A is powerful, and if it has a lot of profits or money that it is sitting on, and usually monopolists have a lot of money that they are sitting on, then it can threaten to buy or take over the firm B. That is, it can, I'm not talking about a physical takeover, that is, there people go and hijack the other firm or take control, physical control of the other firm. I'm talking about takeovers or mergers in the context of stock market events. That is, they go and they value the firm and then they threaten to take over the firm through a hostile takeover or something like that. And if that happens, then the firm B might become afraid, because the firm B might not want itself to be controlled by firm A. So it will say, oh no, we will not enter this market, because if we do, then this firm will take us over. So my friends, those were just some of the reasons or some of the ways in which a monopoly can retain its monopoly position or its monopoly power. Now, we've been talking about this monopoly power and what monopolists can do in order to retain this power. But we still don't have a good understanding of what the advantages or disadvantages of monopoly firms are. I mean, we've said that yes, monopolists can encourage others from, discourage other entrants from coming in, and that obviously doesn't look like a good thing. But earlier we saw that in certain cases, natural monopolies can exist, and there is a rationale, a cost rationale for monopolies to exist. Otherwise, certain products would not be produced. So let's deal with this question of whether monopolies are advantages or disadvantages a little bit further. Before we do that, let me introduce to you the concept of public interest. What is public interest? Public interest is the interest of the public at large. Public is basically you, me, the entire population of a particular country or economy. And the government, in deciding as to whether it wants to allow a monopoly to continue operating, as you know, the government can put restrictions on firms in real life. In a capitalist economy, obviously, it is the market forces which decide who will produce and who will not. But in reality, the government has some bargaining power vis-a-vis all these different firms, and it can ensure as to whether a certain firm can exist as a monopolist or whether a certain minimum level of competition needs to be introduced. The government has that within its remit. So, in order to assess whether a particular firm is good or bad for the public at large, it is important for the government to see what public interest is and how it can be best served. Now, If you remember, I talked to you about marginal cost pricing earlier on. And I said that the optimal point of production for any economy or for the society as a whole was that point at which marginal cost was equal to price. I told you that price has in it embedded the marginal benefit that the society thinks that it will derive from that extra unit, whereas marginal cost is simply the cost to society of producing that extra unit. And therefore, the optimal point of production for the society or the optimal point of allocation of resources is one where the marginal product with the marginal benefit, that is price, is equal to the marginal cost. That we saw was the case in perfect competition. When a firm is operating in a perfectly competitive market, it will choose the output at which price is equal to marginal cost. But this was not the case for a monopoly, and this introduces a problem. Let's dissect this through the use of a graph. Here you see in the graph what outputs would be obtained or what outputs would be produced by a monopolist or by a perfectly competitive firm in the same industry. That is, you have an option either to have a monopolist or a perfectly competitive market structure. What would be the implications for society or consumers as a whole? What happens in the case of a monopoly? As you can see, the monopolist faces a downward sloping demand curve, and therefore he chooses output level Q1 where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Then you can go up all the way to the average revenue curve and read off the price that he will charge to consumers. And this price is simply P1. So the monopolist will produce Q1 units and charge P1 price for those units. Now let's see what happens to the equilibrium price and quantity in the case of the same industry under perfect competition. Now when you have perfect competition, you know that the marginal cost curve for the individual firms is aggregated to become the industry supply curve. Each individual marginal cost curve is equal to the supply curve for that firm, and then those are aggregated to form the industry supply curve. So the point at which the perfectly competitive market would find its equilibrium would be at points where price is P2 and quantity is Q2. As you can see, price has fallen from P1 to P2 and quantity has increased from Q1 to Q2. Price, as you can see, is equal to marginal cost. So that, my friends, was a comparison of the short-run equilibrium that would obtain under a monopoly and the same equilibrium that would obtain under a perfectly competitive setup. And we saw that the prices and outputs in the two equilibria were quite different. In the monopoly case, a higher price was being charged and a lower quantity was being produced. Whereas in a perfectly competitive setup, a lower price was being charged and a higher quantity was being produced. The other implication of this is that with a monopoly, the monopolist is getting higher profits than the perfectly competitive firms. The perfectly competitive firms only make normal profit, in the long run that is. But even in the short run, they cannot be expected to make very high supernormal profits. So there are three implications of this comparison. One is that the monopoly produces a lower quantity at a higher price, whereas perfect competition produces a higher quantity at a lower price. Those are two. Then the profit that is made by the monopolist is higher than that which is made by perfectly competitive firms. And what is profit? Profit is merely the surplus that the producer extracts from selling his goods. So if the profit is higher, that means more of the surplus is accruing to the producer and less is accruing to consumers at large. Now here is where the public interest dimension comes in. The government wants to see that the needs of as many people should be met as it is possible to meet. Therefore, it would like ideally to produce or to see a quantity produced which satisfies many people. A monopoly in that context is not desirable because it produces a lower quantity and that too at a higher price. So the government's objective in all this should be to enable or to force the monopoly to operate at a level where it produces the same quantity at the same price as a perfectly competitive firm. But we will come to that in a short while. Let's now see what happens in the long run. We saw that in the short run, there is this difference. What happens in the long run? In the long run, the perfectly competitive firm, as you know, will operate at a level where the demand curve is at the bottommost point of the long run average cost curve. What happens in the case where the firms make a supernormal profit? Well, if they make supernormal profits, then other firms will enter and eliminate those profits because of an increase in supply and a fall in market price. That's what happens in perfect competition. Note that for a monopoly, the same does not hold. If a monopolist is making very high profits in the short run, that is supernormal profits in the short run, there is no check on the monopolist in the long run. That is, the monopolist can continue to make more and more profits in the long run as well, because there are no other firms entering the market. In fact, the more profits that he earns, the more powerful he becomes, the more he can invest in his brands, the more he can control the supply and demand chains, the more he can control factors of production. And by doing that, his monopoly power can actually increase. So as you can see, there is no check or there is no limit to how much profit a monopolist can earn. The more he earns, the more likely it is that he will earn or continue to earn profits in the future. This is the exact opposite situation for perfect competition. And this immediately has implications for income distribution in the economy. If you have a monopolist firm which is making a lot of profits and those profits are increasing over time, then you can imagine that that monopolist's wealth is also increasing over time, and therefore the concentration of wealth in his hands is increasing. And so this has implications for poverty and income distribution in general. That is, people, the consumers, are increasingly giving up their surplus in favor of the monopolist. So the consumers are becoming worse and worse off, whereas the monopolist is getting better and better off. So this ability of the monopolist to make sustained profits in the long run has negative implications for income distribution in the economy. There is also another reason, a fourth reason, why the government has to be concerned about public interest. And that is related to efficiency. When monopolies become complacent, that is, if there is only one firm in the market and the monopolist knows that no other firm is going to enter, do you think there will be any pressure on the monopolist to rationalize his costs, to produce what he is producing more efficiently, to use his machinery, his human resources, his capital in a more productive way? Hardly. There will be lavish spending, in fact. It is possible that they will have huge offices with luxurious chairs and they will spend their money on things that a perfectly competitive firm might not be able to spend because of the risk of raising their costs. But because a monopolist is complacent or does not have a threat or any threat from other firms, it is likely to lose its cost efficiency in the long term. That is, it is likely that its average cost curve will rise over time. And obviously, this is not a good development for the public at large. I mean, over time, you would like to see firms becoming more efficient in their production, not more inefficient. But monopolies run the risk of doing exactly that. And this has been taken up, this issue has been taken up by many economists and is the subject of great debate. Now, my friends, we've piled up the arguments against monopolies. We've said that this is wrong with monopolies. They create this distortion. they are not right in this way, they are bad in this way, they produce less output at a higher price, consumers suffer, public interest is violated, and therefore we should try to manage or control monopolies or discourage monopolies to the maximum possible extent. Is this a good position to take or a fair position to take? Well, in the light of the discussion so far, perhaps it is. But we need to look at the other side of the debate as well. We need to see what the advantages of monopolies are as well. So let's now focus on the advantages. Now, in the beginning of our discussion, we talked about natural monopolies, economies of scale that are inherent in certain markets or certain industries where the average cost curve is falling for a large part of the output range. And we saw that in those particular cases, it was possible or it was indeed desirable to have one firm producing for the entire market rather than a number of smaller firms. Now let's develop that concept a little bit more in the context of a perfectly competitive firm and a monopolist, but who have different marginal cost curves. And the argument here is that when you have different marginal costs of production, it might be the case that it is only under the monopoly that a certain good will be produced. It might not be produced otherwise. Let's take a look at our example. Now let's take a look at the figure that we have here. There are two marginal cost curves that are drawn. One marginal cost curve is the sum of all the marginal cost curves under perfect competition. And the other marginal cost curve is when the monopolist himself alone produces for the entire market. And the key thing to note here is that the marginal cost curve for the monopolist is much below the marginal cost curve for the sum of perfectly competitive firms. And the implication of this is that at any quantity, the marginal cost of production is higher for perfect competition than it is for the monopolist. Why could this situation or how could this situation arise? This could arise because of the economies of scale that could be inherent in the production process. And we mentioned that the monopolist might be able to use his plant more efficiently. There might be fixed costs that he can distribute over the output better, and for all the other reasons. So it is possible for the marginal cost curve to be below the marginal cost curve for perfect competition. Compare this with our earlier example where we were using the same marginal cost curve for both perfect competition and the monopolist. And there we saw the advantages of perfect competition versus monopoly. Here it is the opposite. Once we allow for different marginal cost curves, we can immediately see why in certain circumstances the monopoly might be more desirable. So here, as you can see, the perfectly competitive option will produce output Q2 at a price of P2, whereas the perfectly competitive firm will choose his output where his marginal cost equals marginal revenue, that is output Q1, and the corresponding price to that will be P1. So, in this case, the price that the monopolist charges is actually lower than the price that is charged by perfectly competitive firms. And the quantity produced by the monopolist is also higher than the quantity that the perfectly competitive firms will be able to produce. Note that this case arises only if the monopoly marginal cost curve is below point X or passes below point X. Because if it passed a marginal revenue curve, or if it intersected the marginal revenue curve at X, then the quantity that the monopolist would choose would also be Q2, and the price that the monopolist would charge would also become equal to P2. Note further that if the monopolist were forced to abide by the marginal cost pricing rule, that is, if we forced him to produce at a point where price was equal to marginal cost, then he will produce Q3 units at a price of P3, which is a much better option than the perfect competition option of P2 and Q2. Now let me make a small qualification on what I have just said. In the graph, you saw that the marginal cost curve of the monopolist was below the marginal cost curve for the combination of perfectly competitive firms. Earlier we've been talking about average cost curves, right? Not marginal cost curves. So why is it that the marginal cost curve for a monopolist might be lower than the marginal cost curve for the perfectly competitive firms? And let me give you an example of, let's say, WAPDA. If WAPDA was to distribute power around the country, it would set up its distribution lines, power lines, right? Which would carry the power or electricity to different parts of the city or the country. Now, if you imagine a situation in which power distribution became a perfectly competitive industry, that is, there were a number of firms which were producing power or distributing power, then each of those firms would have to set up their own distribution lines. And you can imagine how that would create so much duplication. That is, from Lahore to Islamabad, there would be, let's say, 20 or 30 distribution lines running parallel to each other because there are 20 to 30 firms. WAPDA can cut down on that duplication cost by ensuring that only one distribution line is needed, and that will do the job for it because it's the monopoly producer. So that is one example of why a monopoly producer might have a lower marginal cost curve than the combination of perfectly competitive firms. Another advantage of monopolies, which is often quoted, is that the supernormal profits that monopolists make are a very good thing. We've earlier said that they are not a good thing because they come at the expense of the consumer. But some people argue that were it not for the monopoly profits or the supernormal profits that monopolists make, they would not be able to invest in R&D. In fact, some people argue that it is exactly the supernormal profits that monopolists make which permit them to invest in research and development, in improving their production processes, in improving their technologies, in investing in new skills, new ways of production, new ways of delivering different services. And this is what causes their costs to fall in the long run. You understand my point? So the long run, the profits, the supernormal profits that the monopolist makes in the long run is the engine for driving costs down for the monopolist as well. This is one argument which is presented in favor of monopolies, that because they allow for supernormal profits in the long run, they have the resources which are needed to invest in a reduction of costs in the long run. Finally, my friends, there is the argument about innovation, that is, to create new products and new processes. And the argument here is that if you do not give people the incentive of supernormal profits, that is, if you do not give firms the incentive of making a lot of money on the products that they are selling, they will not invest in new products. They will not invest in innovation. That is, the number or the type of goods that you have before you will remain stagnant. If you are to encourage new ideas to be translated into products and services and processes, then you need to give some incentive, some money and profit incentive to the people who are innovating, the people involved in producing these goods. And this is a very tense debate between people who are in favor of monopolies and people who might oppose certain monopolies, because here is where the argument about public interest becomes a very difficult one to arbitrate on. Because on the one hand, you want innovation to happen in society, so you want new products, you want new processes. But on the other hand, you do not want the people who are innovating to make so much money that the benefits of that innovation are not really passed to the consumers. So if a new product is launched, but it costs so much. The monopolist charges such a high price for it that the ordinary person can't afford it. What benefit does it have for the ordinary man or for the common man? So this is a very difficult point to arbitrate on, but it is cited as one of the advantages of a monopoly in that it encourages innovation. And if you remove the incentive for monopoly profits or supernormal profits, then there will be less and less innovation in society. Now, my friends, we have enumerated the various disadvantages of monopolies, and we have enumerated the possible advantages of monopolies. Monopolies are most advantageous when they are natural monopolies. That is, there are economies of scale at play, or where monopolies lead to innovation, or where monopolies lead to cost reduction techniques being invented in the long run. On the other hand, monopolies are disadvantageous when they are based, or when they are based on limit pricing or strategies by monopolists which deter the entry of other firms in the market. When monopolists try to manipulate or control the supply and demand chains, that is not something that is viewed very desirably by consumers or the government in that respect. And therefore, there might be a role for the government in making sure that the advantages of monopolies remain higher than their disadvantages. Often, the government in even the most capitalist economies is sought, its help is, its intervention is sought in arbitrating over whether the benefits of a particular monopoly are exceeding its costs or whether the costs or disadvantages are becoming higher. There was a recent case, a big antitrust case against Microsoft Corporation, where Microsoft and Netscape were in battle against over whether Microsoft should keep its monopoly position or whether it had adopted certain practices which were undesirable and were tantamount to deterring healthy competition in the industry. And I've heard that the case was resolved or settled outside of court, and that Microsoft did get its point across as well, but there was an argument that Microsoft should discontinue some of the practices that it was pursuing. So this tension between where the optimal balance is between the benefits and the disadvantages of a monopoly is a very difficult matter. Nonetheless, given the situation that we have, we need to understand what possible role the government can play. And for the time being, we'll restrict our discussion to the case of natural monopolies. That is, monopolies in which there is external economies of scale at play. There are the average cost curve is falling for a large segment of the output. Now, a role for government regulation basically says that you need regulatory authorities in markets which are prone to becoming monopolies. So, as you know, there is usually a regulatory authority when you have a telecommunications, in the telecommunications sector, in the power sector. You usually have regulatory authorities where public utilities are concerned, because these are the industries which are most likely to develop monopolistic tendencies. Let's see two examples of a monopoly and how the government can play a role, in one case through a subsidy and in another case through a tax, to ensure that the benefits of the monopoly fully accrue, whereas its disadvantages are minimized. Let's look at a couple of slides for that. Now let's take a look at this graph where you have an unregulated monopolist. When I say unregulated monopolist, I mean that a monopolist who is free to operate as he wishes. That is, he's free to maximize his profits and choose the output level that he wishes to. So the unregulated monopolist would produce 400 units. That is, this is the point where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. He will then sell these 400 units at a price of $12. This is basically where the 400 units line cuts the average revenue or demand curve, and you can read it off on the vertical axis and you get $12. He will receive a supernormal profit of $1 per unit, and this is simply price minus average cost at Q is equal to 400. The total profit that he will earn is $400, which is simply the $1 per unit profit multiplied by the 400 units that he sells. Now let's see what happens when the government comes in. The government could set two possible prices for the monopolist. It could come in and order the monopolist to set the price at P is equal to $9, where P is equal to average cost, so that the monopolist would break even, that is, he would earn only a normal or fair profit at Q is equal to 600 units. So this is one possible option for the government to ensure that the monopolist does not make supernormal profits. However, if you note, at this point, price still exceeds marginal cost, and there still remains some misallocation of resources. At price equals marginal cost, that is where the demand curve crosses marginal cost, P is less than AC, that is price is less than average cost. Therefore, in this case, this monopolist would incur a loss. And unless the government would give the monopolist a compensating subsidy, the monopolist would refuse to produce 600 units at a price of $9. This is simple common sense. However, often in practice, it becomes difficult for the government to administer subsidies, and therefore, in practice, you often find governments setting price is equal to average cost for public utilities. Now let's take a slightly different example in which a different government response might be needed. That is, instead of a subsidy, we might need the government to impose a tax on the monopolist. Now if you look at the graph, the unregulated monopolist would produce OA, at which marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. So he would produce OA units of output. He will sell these OA units at a price which is equal to AF on the vertical axis. That is where you hit the demand curve on top. He will receive a profit FC per unit, and FC times OA will give the total profit. Now the government, if it comes in, can order the monopolist to set its price equal to average cost. And we saw that the government could order that in the previous example. Then the monopolist would produce OK units and sell them at P is equal to average cost, which is equal to KL. And he would break even, that is, he would make normal profits. However, P here is smaller than marginal cost, and therefore resources are misallocated. Remember that price should be equal to marginal cost for optimal allocation of resources. So now, if the government were to set P is equal to MC, the monopolist would produce OG units, sell them at P is equal to GJ, and obtain a profit per unit of JH. The key difference that this example has with the previous example is that when price is equal to marginal cost, price is greater than average cost, and therefore the monopolist makes a profit. Earlier, at the point where price was equal to marginal cost, the monopolist was making a loss, and therefore the government had to pay a subsidy. But now, because the monopolist is making a profit, the case for subsidy is certainly not there. In fact, the government could impose a tax, a lump sum or flat tax on the monopolist in order to make sure that the monopolist does not make supernormal profits. What would be the size of this tax? Well, the size of this tax would simply be equal to the per unit profit that the monopolist is making at the point where P is equal to MC. So the per unit tax would be equal to JH, and the total tax that the government will collect would be JH times OG. And this will ensure that all the monopolist supernormal profits are taxed away. Now the examples that we've just studied are not simple at all. The graphs are quite complicated. The lines, the way you're moving about the graph, it's quite complex. So I would suggest that you go home and attempt some of the questions that I've put up for you for practice purposes, it is very important for you to understand what exactly is happening in this case. The graphs are true. They will not speak lies to you. So you make sure that you just spend enough time there to understand what really is happening at the bottom of it. But do get a grasp of it, because this is a very important part of the profit maximization segment of this course. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit more about monopolists, and especially about price discrimination. Price discrimination is a concept where a monopolist firm or a firm in a monopoly position can charge different prices to different customers, or different prices in different markets. You might recall I gave you the example of a firm producing table tennis balls, and I said that usually the price that the table tennis producer will charge will be a constant price. That is, let's say 5 rupees per ball. However, I also said that it is possible for there to be different prices for different consumers. That is, the table tennis producer could charge rupees 4 for a certain number of balls sold to a certain group, charge rupees 6, and then charge rupees 5. And we then would see what the weighted average price of that firm would be, and that would be equal to its average revenue. Now, this situation can exist in the case of monopolies. Monopolists can charge different prices to different consumers, and you don't even need monopolists for that. Even in oligopolistic structures or non-perfectly competitive structures, you can have individual firms charging different prices to different consumers. I'll give you a number of examples from our daily life which will illustrate how the same product is sold to different people at different price, sometimes because of lack of information reasons, and sometimes because of elasticity of demand reasons. But we will take this issue up in greater detail in our next lecture. So, my friends, with that, we come to the end of today's lecture. We have covered a lot of ground today. We've understood better what monopolies are, how they operate. We understood how they maximize profits. We understood what the implications of a monopolist's profit maximization decisions were for public interest at large. Then we discussed the advantages and disadvantages of monopolies, and we saw how a role for government was warranted in order to balance the advantages versus disadvantages, at least for the public utilities and natural monopolies. In our next lecture, we will talk about, of course, price discrimination, but we will also briefly talk about oligopolistic structures of market and imperfect competition as it is represented by monopolistic competition, and also a little bit about game theory. So till the next lecture, it is Khuda Hafiz and Assalamu Alaikum.